Chapter 3. The spell no one could see. Loki had never been the one to leave things to chance, not when it came to her. She would never allow him to weave a spell of protection around her knowingly. She was too proud, too independent to accept such a thing. So he had not asked. He had simply done it. The spell was not a leash nor a cage. It did not bind her, did not control her. It would never force her hand or influence her choices. It was a tether. A thread of pure ancient magic woven so deeply into her being that it had become part of her. It did not change her, did not alter who she was. It merely ensured that should the day ever come when she faced true, inescapable danger, Loki would be there, instantly, no matter where, no matter what. The only trace of it, if one knew exactly what to look for, was a faint, almost imperceivable shimmer beneath her skin when the light caught it just right. Like the ghost of something unseen, flickering at the edges of reality. But no one had noticed. Not yet. Until Stephen Strange stepped into their path. A meeting of two sorcerers. It happened in a place of knowledge. Where else? Kamar-Taj had always been a crossroads of power, a place where the air thrummed with the presence of magic old and new. And when the ranger had stepped into its hall, Stephen Strange had immediately felt it. Something was off. Not wrong, not corrupt, but different. His magic was attuned to things that should not be, fluctuations in time, distortions in space. And she carried something woven into her very soul, something masterful, something he could not immediately understand. It wasn't dark magic, it wasn't destructive, but it was old and potent. He watched her as she moved, spoke completely unaware of the quiet hum of energy that clung to her like a second skin. He almost said something, until his gaze flickered to Loki. And the moment their eyes met, the moment Strange saw the way Loki's expression remained perfectly neutral, he knew. It was him. And Loki knew that he knew. The confrontation. Strange did not speak of it immediately. He waited until the ranger was gone, until she stepped beyond earshot. Only then did he turn to Loki, arms crossing, his gaze sharp. "You placed a spell on her." Loki smirked. "How delightful of you to notice." Strange did not smile. "What does it do?" "Nothing," Loki said smoothly, "unless it's needed." Strange narrowed his eyes. "That's not an answer." Loki tilted his head, feigning thoughtfulness. "And yet, it's the only one you are going to receive." Strange let out a slow breath, considering. "It's ancient, too well hidden for even me to decipher completely. And yet," he arched a brow, "you expect me to simply accept that it's harmless?" Loki's smirk remained, but something sharpened in his gaze. "If I had wanted to harm her, Strange," he said quietly, "do you truly think I would need such subtlety?" A beat of silence. Strange watched him. Loki did not waver. He had expected the Sorcerer Supreme to notice, eventually. But what he had not expected was that Strange understood. Because he would have done the same. And Loki saw it in his eyes, the flicker of recognition, of empathy. Though Strange would never say it aloud. He knew loss. He knew fear. The kind that lived in your ribs. The kind that settled in your bones when you found something worth losing. Something worth protecting. Strange sighed. "She doesn't know, does she?" Loki's smirk was softer now, his gaze flickering for just a moment in the direction the ranger had gone. "No." Will you tell her? Loki chuckled, folding his arms. And ruin the fun of having a secret? Strange shook his head. This could backfire on you, you know. Oh, undoubtedly, Loki mused, voice casual. But what is life without a little risk? Strange let out a slow exhale, rubbing his temple. You're insufferable. And yet, here you stand, keeping my secret. A long pause. Then, Strange sighed. I won't tell her. Loki's smirk returned, sharper now. Of course you won't. Because if Strange had the power to do what Loki had done, he would have done it too. And Loki knew it. The unspoken truth. The Ranger would never know, not unless she was placed in true danger, not unless the spell activated, pulling Loki to her side in an instant no matter the cost. Until then, she would live freely as she always had. She would never feel the weight of his protection, because she did not need to. And Strange? Strange would carry that knowledge with him, an unspoken truth, a secret between two men who understood something that words would never need to say. Because if Strange had the power to keep someone safe in this way, he would have done it too. And Loki knew it. And that was enough. The price of knowledge. The question came long after the initial meeting. Long after Stephen Strange had first sensed the undeniable weight of the spell Loki had woven into the Ranger's very being. Long after he had chosen to keep that secret, and yet it remained with him. It gnawed at the edges of his thoughts, an unfinished puzzle that should have been beneath him, a mystery he should have been able to unravel. And yet he couldn't. Ancient, subtle, absolute. The kind of magic that should not exist, at least not in a form so perfectly concealed that even he could barely sense it. But it did exist, and it had been crafted by Loki. A weak moment. The night was late. The Sanctum Sanctorum was quiet, its halls humming with the faint remnants of protective wards, the ever-present energy of the relics housed within its walls. Stephen sat in the library, finger idly tracing the rim of a half-finished glass of whiskey, staring into the embers of the dying fire. And then a flicker of magic, a subtle shift in the air, a presence that did not belong, yet one that was expected. Stephen exhaled slowly. You know, he mused, not bothering to look up. Most people use doors. A low chuckle answered. Most people are dull. Loki stood at the edge of the room, arms folded, amusement glinting in his sharp green eyes. Stephen did not ask why he was here. Maybe he knew. Or maybe he was simply too tired to pretend he didn't. He let out a slow breath, staring into his drink. Teach me. Loki arched a brow. Oh, a demand, is it? Stephen finally turned his gaze toward him. You know what I'm asking. Loki smirked, but it wasn't the smirk of a trickster. It was the smirk of a man who knew the weight of what he held, the weight of power. You wish to learn the magic you were never meant to wield, Loki murmured, to shape reality in ways even you do not yet understand. I wish to understand it. Loki exhaled through his nose, stepping forward, his expression unreadable. Tell me something strange. Stephen leaned back slightly, watching him. What? What do you want to know? Loki's voice was too calm, too measured. Stephen hesitated. He could lie. He could say it was simply curiosity, a desire for knowledge, an unwillingness to let something remain beyond his grasp. But Loki would see through it. So instead, he spoke the truth. Because if I had the power to do what you did, his voice was quieter now, the weight of it heavier than before, I would have used it. Loki's smirk faded. For a long moment neither of them spoke. Then Loki chuckled. A low, knowing sound full of something, not quite amusement, not quite sorrow. Ah, Stephen. He turned, pacing slowly, hands clasped behind his back. You wish to learn. Fine. I will teach you something. Stephen straightened slightly, eyes sharp. The spell? Loki glanced over his shoulder. No. Stephen frowned. Then what? Not all power is meant to be learned, Loki murmured, turning to face him fully. But you insist on understanding something greater than yourself. Then I shall teach you something far more valuable than a spell, strange. Stephen narrowed his eyes. And what would that be? Loki tilted his head, his smirk faint, but his eyes unreadable. How to accept that some things are beyond even you. Silence. Stranger's jaw tightened. You're enjoying this. Loki chuckled. Immensely. Stephen let out a slow breath, frustration flickering across his features. You won't teach me then. Loki's gaze darkened, not with amusement, but with something deeper. And there are powers, strange, he said softly, that do not belong in your hands. Powers that do not care for your titles, nor for your intellect, nor for your endless pursuit of understanding. He stepped forward, voice lowering. And the magic I have woven into her. His head tilted. That is not a lesson I'm willing to give. Stephen studied him for a long moment. Then, finally, he nodded. Because if you had the power to do what I did, Loki murmured, you would not stop at just one. A flicker of something passed across Stranger's face. And Loki knew he was right. Because he himself had been there once, desperate to hold on, to protect something he could not bear to lose. Loki turned away, walking towards the shadows. I have already done what you could not. He smirked, glancing over his shoulder one last time. And that will have to be enough for you, Sorcerer Supreme. And then he was gone, leaving Strange alone, to wonder, to regret, and to understand. Because Loki had been right. If he had that power, he would not have stopped at just one. And that was why he would never learn it. The unspoken lesson. Stephen would never ask again. Not because he did not want to know, but because he knew better now. And Loki? Loki had already taught him more than he had ever intended to. Because sometimes the greatest lesson is knowing when to let go. And that was knowledge Stephen Strange would carry with him forever. The lesson in truth. Stephen Strange was not accustomed to feeling small. Not after everything he had endured. Not after the battles fought, the sacrifices made, the universe-altering knowledge he had acquired. And yet, as he sat alone in the dimly lit sanctum, whiskey untouched, staring at the dying embers of the fire, he felt it. Not in the way a lesser sorceress might, overwhelmed, defeated. No, this was something different, something heavier, something uncomfortable, because this time he had been the apprentice, and Loki had been the master. The weight of humility. He had always believed he understood Loki. Oh, he'd never trusted him, not fully. He wasn't foolish. Loki was a liar, a trickster, a chaos-born force, wrapped in silver-tongued charm and unpredictability. Strange had studied everything he could about him. The history of Asgard, the conflict with Thor, the betrayals, the grand manipulations. He had thought himself above Loki, the sorcerer supreme, the protector of reality itself. Loki was clever, but Stephen was wise. Or so he had believed, until tonight. Because tonight, Loki had taught him something. And the worst part, it had nothing to do with magic. The truth that burned. Stephen ran his hand down his face, exhaling slowly. He hated this. Not because he had been outmatched, not in power, not skill, but because Loki had done something infinitely worse. He had understood him completely. And that was unacceptable. Because Loki had been right. Had Strange possessed the power to bind someone to him so absolutely, so subtly, so completely without their knowledge, he would have done it. Not for control, not for selfish gain, but for love, for fear. Because the thought of losing someone, the thought of standing helpless while fate took and took and took, it was unbearable. Loki had seen it in him, had recognized it, because he had lived it too. And that was what unsettled Strange the most. Not that Loki had power beyond his understanding, but he had wisdom beyond his own. A bitter pill to swallow. The fire crackled softly as Stephen sat motionless, staring at his own reflection in the whiskey glass. He had spent years believing Loki was a fool. A dangerous fool, but a fool nonetheless. And yet, when had a trickster become so measured, so deliberate? When had he stepped beyond the games, beyond the chaos, beyond the need to prove himself, and simply become? And how had Strange missed it? The answer was simple. Arrogance. Stephen prided himself on being a man of knowledge. But knowledge was not wisdom. And tonight, Loki had proven it. The acceptance of defeat. Strange closed his eyes, letting out a slow, quiet chuckle. Not of amusement, but of resignation. He had spent so long thinking himself Loki's better, and yet, tonight, he had been the student, and Loki had been the teacher. The truth was a bitter pill. But Stephen swallowed it nonetheless. Because that was the difference between him and those who clung to the illusions of superiority. He had the strength to admit when he had been wrong. The unspoken gratitude. Would he ever tell Loki this? Would he ever admit that he, for just this one moment, Loki had been right? Not a chance in hell! But in the quiet of the sanctum, as the embers burned low and the weight of the truth settled into his bones, Stephen lifted the whiskey glass to his lips, took a slow sip, and gave a smallest nod to the empty room. Well played, Loki. And though the god of mischief was nowhere in sight, though he was likely galaxies away, at that very moment, Strange had the distinct unsettling feeling that somewhere, Loki was smirking.